Honourable David Parker.
That's the Minister of Education who was quoted in the House today by Mr Mallard as having said that it's disgraceful that 1/5 of all students are in the bottom 20% of student performance. Unfortunately, that grasp of statistical logic is matched only in her cabinet by Mr Brownlee because, of course, in respect of students, it will always be the case that 1/5 of students are in the bottom 20% of performance. It can never be anything else. And sadly, this lack of grasp with what are the fundamentals of portfolio extends beyond Mrs Tolley into the economic development portfolio that Mr Brownlee is responsible for. And why is it that New Zealand's been starting to pay attention to this, not just politicians but also journalists and also the wider public? Well, it's because it's become increasingly obvious that the national government doesn't have any plan to meet its promise of catching up with the fortunes of Australia and closing the wage gap with Australia by 2025. And why has that become obvious? Well, of course, the central plank to the Minister of Economic Development's part in all that was the step change that he was going to bring about in the New Zealand economy by mining national parks. And of course, that was such a silly idea in the first place, that it was eventually unpicked. And after 40,000 people marched down the streets of Queen Street in Auckland, and after similarly large protests in other parts of the country from Invercargill to the north, the national government did what they always do, and that is they caved to public pressure. And that was actually the right decision on this occasion, because it was always a nonsense to mine in national parks and other Schedule 4 areas like the Coromandel, but it did lay bare the cupboard. The cupboard is bare when it comes to realistic ways in which the government's going to bridge the income gap with Australia. We had then the Minister of Economic Development come down to this House and try to pretend that he was on top of his portfolio, and he told the House that the wage gap was narrowing. The media were, of course, all over that immediately because it was obvious no matter what way you measure it, the gap has been growing and hasn't been narrowing. And this is an important debate to have at this time, because this debate is about the estimates. This is when Parliament votes taxes to be gathered and spent by the government. And unless this Parliament has confidence in what they're doing to achieve their aims, this motion that the House is voting upon should go down. And so we have to ask ourselves, this is the second budget of 3 that will be delivered by Bill English. Second of 3, we have to ask whether they're measuring up. And of course, Mr Brownlee has shown that they're not. Mr Brownlee has shown that he hasn't even got a basic grasp on whether the gap's getting bigger or smaller. He said that the gap was getting smaller. Well, what did the third-party commentators say about that? Well, the Dominion Post said stats proved Brownlee wrong. That was pretty clear, pretty definitive. On that same day, we had John Key coming down to the House after that headline had been in the paper, trying to say that black was white, trying to say that the gap was narrowing. And he came to this House and he thought we were all so dim that we would accept the statistics that he tried to palm off to the House, and then he was forced to table the document from which he was quoting. And his own document that he was quoting showed that even in the best massage figures that the government could produce, the gap was getting bigger. The gap was getting bigger. That was the same day that the Sydney Morning Herald had on one of its main headings, New Zealand wage gap with Australia widens, Australian workers are being paid even more than their Kiwi cousins since National became the government. And then there's another interesting paragraph lower down in that, and it noted that Australia's top tax was higher than New Zealand, and the reason New Zealanders were going to live there in Australia was wages, not taxes. And Mr English should take a lesson from that. Tax policy is not economic policy. It is but a subset of it. And of course the government doesn't have anything other than a tax policy when it comes to economic policy. That plus a bit of reform of the RMA they pretend will somehow cause the gap to narrow with Australia. Well, what did the television stations say in respect of John Key after he came to the House and tried to tried to sort of blather his way through and deny the reality that the gap has in fact been growing rather than shrinking. And TV3 said this: Key too selective and slippery. John Key should stop the Slippery Act immediately. Yesterday's performance in Parliament was too selective and too slippery for him to get away with. So here we have not just the Minister of Economic Development not really on top of things, the Prime Minister hasn't been either. What did the Herald say in the weekend? Well, the Herald did an editorial on this issue, and it said, and I'm going to read from it, it said, trudging along the same old road is not going to produce the desired outcome. It then said, it noted that the stats show that the gap has been growing with Australia rather than shrinking. And then it said, this provided the opportunity for the government to make its own commentary on the government's attempt to close the gap. And then it said, which so far has encompassed little more than tinkering with the Resource Management Act and such like. Again, the editorial of New Zealand's largest newspaper has said that really the government is tinkering. They are but tinkering. They have no significant plan to bridge the income gap with Australia. They went on. They say, in reality, the government fears the political damage that would result from anything more significant. And I'm quoting from this accent on short-term popularity has also engendered a cautious approach in other areas that might deliver long-term benefit, including most recently the mining of conservation land. And this really sums it up, the final sentence of their editorial, but when relatively little is done, relatively little happens, things can even go backwards. I'm going to say that again because it encapsulates the story of this government. When relatively little is done, relatively little happens, things can even go backwards. And that's the story of the National Party. Relatively little is being done, relatively little is happening to bridge the income gap with Australia, and as a consequence...
Point of order, Paul Quinn.
Mr Speaker, my understanding of standing orders is that only the Speaker at any point in time is allowed to use assistants and placards and such, and in fact we had the whip flashing around paper above.
Quite right.
Look, I didn't see it, and I hear what the member's saying, but I'll ask the Honourable David Parker to continue.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It is interesting, isn't it, that they're breaking up my speech on this. This is New Zealand's largest newspaper, the New Zealand Herald. Their editorial in the weekend concludes with this statement, but when relatively little is done, relatively little happens, things can go backwards. And that says it all about the National Party's economic policy. The cupboard is bare. We had the Deputy Prime Minister caught on tape at the National Party conference a year or two ago saying of the now Prime Minister that John Key flits from cloud to cloud. And we've seen one idea put up there after another on a cloud. The first was a cycleway, not a bad idea, but never going to create many jobs. Then we had the Jobs Summit, nothing else came of that of substance. We had the 9-day fortnight, which virtually no one took up. Then we had the idea that New Zealand was going to mine our national parks, and that was going to be the step change in the New Zealand economy. Those words about the step change in the New Zealand economy came from Mr Brownlee. We had Mr Key in his speech to Parliament at the start of this year placing much credence upon the part that this increase in mining was going to have on New Zealand's economic recovery. In his view, that was a major part of how we were going to catch up with Australia, and of course they've abandoned that ambition. Since then, we've had the next idea floated on a cloud was this idea that we were going to be a financial services hub for the world. Well, you know, New Zealand, which has got such a poor savings record, which has got such thin capital markets, is just not got a hope in hell of doing that compared with Australia just across the ditch. They've got better savings, deeper investment markets. They have some hope of being a financial services sector in a way that is not at all realistic for New Zealand. Instead, the government goes backwards on savings. They continue to attack wages in New Zealand, wages and conditions of New Zealand workers by making our terms and conditions for New Zealand workers worse than they can get in Australia, which again will be encouraging the flow of people to Australia rather than the other way around. When we look through the estimates and we see what it is that the Ministry of Economic Development is doing that's new this year compared with last. There was one thing that stood out for me.